What's going on, guys? Welcome to episode 14 of the Data Driven Strength Podcast. Today, I have Josh and Jake with me hopping on the mics to have another Q&A episode. So without further ado, let's go ahead and hop into the first question. I'm going to read this one to you, Josh, to go ahead and get us started. So our first question is from Santos, and he is asking, when we're coaching a new client, so, someone that has, been training for 2 to 3 years and has some experience with online templates and a little bit of knowledge, so not a complete rank novice, and who wants like a powerlifting style program, how do you approach identifying the kind of volume that best fits this individual and specifically the rep range for that volume? So is it purely a trial and error process, or do you start at kind of a lower end of what we think is reasonable and kind of add sets and work our way up? Or what is your process for kind of solving that problem? So I'll kick it to you, Josh.
Yeah, I think this is a really good question. And I think this is probably the most one of the most important aspects of the individualization process is finding that appropriate range of volume for the individual. We like to slightly adjust the terminology there and call it the total training dose for the individual, which does scale pretty well with volume, but it kind of encompasses everything. So we'll probably frame this around the total training dose. Um, in a way, I like to think of the total training dose and how that is into and how we can individualize that total training dose is that um, if you have individual A and you give them an objective or like a fixed absolute quantity of a certain training variable, if you give that to individual A and you give that same exact thing to individual B, depending on their psychology, the way they approach those sets, potentially physiological differences, that may result in a different training dose for that individual. So I again, the point is here is that I do think different training doses make sense for different individuals. And again, the question is asking, how do you approach getting to that appropriate range for the individual? Um, and I think to put it very simply, my answer here is that you need to make your best guess to start, and then you see that training cycle through, and then you analyze the training cycle and you make adjustments from there. So I think people can get in can really kind of get in trouble here if they try to be way too reactive with adjusting training volume or adjusting the total training dose, however you want to think about it. Um, you know, oh, on Monday's session, I felt, or after Monday's session, I felt more soreness than expected. So thus for Thursday's session, maybe you're squatting Monday, Thursday. For Thursday session, I have to adjust the training volume. I don't think that's a very helpful way to go about it, because then you're always kind of going back and forth between different, amounts of training volume, different doses of training, and then you have no idea what's actually working for the individual, right? So let's say you kind of take that super reactive approach, right? It feels good to be in touch with the athlete. It feels good to kind of make these changes because, as a coach, you do care about the athlete and you want to kind of show that. And I think that's awesome. But there's definitely, you can get to a point of doing that too much. And really being reactive. And then let's say that training block or that training cycle doesn't go well. You're kind of going back and forth between these different training doses. And again, that training block or that training cycle doesn't go super well. You also don't really know how much training they were doing because it wasn't really constant. And then you have no good training data. So they didn't progress. And now you also don't have good training data to really prove that what you did or didn't work. So that's kind of how I would kick off the response there. Zach, Jake, if you guys have anything to add in, I know we still have to talk about the rep range aspect of this question, but see if you guys have any thoughts right off the bat.
Yeah, I'll kind of go in of maybe giving a little bit more of a practical answer of like how you would actually do this with a client, because that's where kind of my head went. So a client comes to me, and the kind of the question that's being asked is, how do we find maybe where we're going to start with them in terms of volume and how we're going to look to progress. So I think for the first part of it, I think this comes down to two things. I think the first thing is this individual isn't a complete rank novice, so I'm definitely going to start with their training history. What has worked well? What hasn't worked well? What amounts of volume did they seem to tolerate subjectively, and also make decent objective progress on? And that's an obvious place to start, especially if they've had some experience with some past like template or free programs online. It's a really helpful thing from a coaching perspective, because if they've tried a very high volume program and it went poorly, but they tried a very low volume program and that went pretty well, I'm probably going to start somewhere on the latter end. The other thing, and I think we've talked about this a few times, is that I think this is why systematizing your coaching process and also becoming very familiar with certain, like narrowing your pools of metrics or things that you're using to evaluate an athlete is very, very helpful, because I think this allows you to kind of identify uh, athlete archetypes. And I don't want to mean that in like a very, very specific sense, but if I have an individual that is of similar proportions, similar kind of training history, reports similar subjective kind of feelings of what they think they need, and I'm using kind of a similar thought process for where I'm going to start with most people, I can start to identify trends of like, this person seems to be more similar to this client that I've coached, or this group of athletes that seem to do well with XYZ training protocol. I'm probably going to start with that in kind of my terms of where I would look to individualize from. And I think that the more experience you get with a similar coaching system is going to allow you to kind of pick out these archetypes. Now, obviously, those aren't black and white characterizations. It's just try to jumpstart the individualization process a little bit further. So hopefully, you could get somebody who theoretically needs a high bench press volume. If you've had multiple athletes that are very similar to this person and they also need high bench press volume, hopefully you can get them on that path to success a little bit quicker. So I think that's just another reason why having a narrow pool of things that you're looking at, become very familiar with those things and measurements, and also their blind spots, is helpful to kind of kickstart you in the direction of individualization a bit faster. And then finally, once we've began the first training cycle, training block, or whatever, I think it's just very important to realize that we are optimizing for progress and not optimizing for volume itself. So you could arrange a training program that allows somebody to do the most volume and theoretically recover from it. But if that ultimately doesn't result in positive changes in what you actually care about, which in this case I'm assuming is strength, then that's not necessarily what we're after. So design a training program that's around the outcome of interest, and then look to progress that, which may be different. It may be muscle growth, maybe strength. That would slightly change the context of what you're doing. But just always remember that when we're looking to individualize a part of the training program, that's still in the grander scheme of actually optimizing for an outcome and not necessarily the metric itself. So, Jake, go ahead and chime in there too.
Yeah, I think uh, to give maybe flesh out that example a little bit of just like a practical what you would do with a new person, how you're talking about using their training history, and I think just to kind of drive that home a little bit more, what I always do is if they have those like recent training blocks, I think it can be very simple in just in terms of like you can dig into that training spreadsheet or whatever it is that they send you, look at the volume, look at the average intensity, average RPE, whatever, all the training dose factors, and look at what was their progress like. And then I think a lot of people get confused on, okay, well, I have all this information now. What do I do? Where do I go from here? I think it can be as simple as almost like an algorithm, I guess, in a way, where let's say, for example, they were doing whatever, 25 sets of bench press. Their progress wasn't great. Okay, what do I do from here? Just getting that feedback from the person about like, did they feel really practiced with their technique? Were they super sore all the time, or did they feel really fresh all the time? Like those, if they're super sore all the time, then maybe let's try backing off the volume. Versus if they felt really fresh and unpracticed and whatever, maybe more, right? Some people need a lot of volume, right? So I think that just to kind of give a more hands-on example of how to actually find that um, next step, I think is maybe helpful. Do you guys want to tackle this, how to find the best rep range for the person part of the
Yeah.
question here?
Yeah, we can dive into that in a second, but Jake, I totally echo what you're saying there. I think you guys did a nice job of making the answer to this question nice and practical. I think like coaching is a lot more than just deciding their total training dose and then letting them run with it and see what happens. Like for example, I've had a couple clients a couple clients that I'm currently working with who, when we first started, doing very high bench volumes, and they still feel fresh. They feel like they could handle more. But this was actually a case where I went the opposite direction and I said, let's really focus on set quality. I want to see you do some really solid whatever dumbbell bench or weighted push-ups, and I want to see these videos and I want to see you go into like a true RPE, true RP9, because if you just look at the spreadsheet or the document of their old training on paper and you quantify the total training dose, that's just kind of a subjective quantification, but nonetheless that's limited, right? Because it also depends on the execution of that training dose, right? If I give individual A 12 sets, the exact same protocol as what I give individual B, again, also 12 sets, those can be much, much different based on execution. So again, this is kind of where the art of coaching, I think, comes in. You have to, like you said, Jake, there's definitely some algorithmic aspects to it, but it's also like, what intangibles are we potentially leaving on the table here, and maybe we go the opposite direction. So I totally agree with you guys. I just think that's another thing to keep in mind. If we're good to go there, we can kind of briefly talk about the whole rep range thing here. So this question says, again, we're still on the first question, and again, the question was asking how to identify the sufficient range of volume, and they also said the rep range for the volume. um, Zach, I'll probably kick this over to you here in a second, but my initial thoughts right off the bat are just that I don't view rep range as something we are inherently individualizing for, or at least it's not a big rock. It's potentially a downstream effect of what you're actually trying to individualize. So maybe I have a certain lifter where I generally think we should do higher rep top sets on their squat. Yes, I'm individualizing training volume, but I'm not, yes, I'm individualizing the rep range, but I'm individualizing the heavy exposure. I'm not thinking about the rep range in and of itself, if that makes sense, because I think that's going to be the appropriate training dose for their top set for that individual. So that's where my head goes, is that rep range is a downstream effect of individualizing training dose and the components of that training dose, and not something that we're inherently saying, okay, this individual is best with sets of 8 to 15. This individual sets of 5 to 8. This individual sets of 1 to 4. That's just not how I conceptualize it. But Zach, I don't know if you want to add something there.
I think from a philosophical perspective, the first thing I thought of is like, as like super training nerds, like we often, view this in the context of, oh, the research says you can get, for example, in muscle growth, I can have equal hypertrophy ranging from sets of 1 all the way up to sets of 35 or maybe even greater than that. And so like, oh man, there's just so much individualization to be had here in terms of repetition range. But I think once you start to layer on the practical perspectives of not only the exercise, but then subjective preference, I think that the first thing to say is that I think the range of the repetition range you're talking about for a given outcome becomes significantly narrower than I think people realize. So let's just say, again, you start from this place of, oh, we could use sets of 1 all the way to 35. But then I'm talking about a squat for someone who's not a masochist and enjoys sets of 15 to a legit 8 to 9 RP on squat. Probably not going to be a thing for most people. So you have like a reasonable practical cap of like 10 reps on squats, and then you add on the fact that, okay, the goal of this set is for muscle growth. So in general, to be more efficient for that, you're probably going to be somewhere above that 5 repetition range or so. So now we're talking 6 to 10 reps, and then from there it's like, how much are you really individualizing things within a 4 repetition range? It's really not that much. So I think, like Josh said, I very much view this as a downstream effect. After you've given the set a job, which is, generally for us, it's going to be strength practice or, skill practice, or it's going to be muscle growth. Like once you've given a set a job, and then you layer on the practical constraints of, yeah, dude, I'm like, just no matter what research says or what the paper says, I'm not doing a set of 15 to a 9 RP on low bar squats. It's just not going to happen. Once you layer that context on, I think the possibilities become significantly more narrow. And then once you have the basic principles of set quality, like Josh said in the last part of this question, I think that equally applies to this. Like we always talk about, it's kind of a joke, but it's kind of not. Like a set of 20 at 9 doesn't exist on a multi-joint exercise. We talk about that a lot as like kind of a joke, but like we actually kind of believe that. Like the amount of discomfort necessary to get to that point is just so far exceeding what people generally do, and the perception of effort and perception of discomfort definitely don't align in that instance. So it's just, again, once you layer on the practical constraints, I think the repetition range problem becomes significantly less, because the ranges you're dealing with become more and more insignificant. So like just taking that on the strength end, what's the difference between sets of 2 to 5? You can make an argument to some degree that, there's a little bit of a difference there, but it's mostly going to be, in my opinion, a matter of what can this person tolerate? What do they enjoy? And then as long as the set has a job, is this kind of decision fulfilling that goal? And as long as we're doing so, I think that's repetition range is probably going to take care of itself.
I think you guys covered that really well. I think to kind of maybe round this out and think about one, how I tend to kind of conceptualize it too, and Josh, I really like what you said, is in a way I kind of think of it as we're not really targeting a rep range, we're targeting an amount of loading and a proximity to failure, and together those by definition have to result in a certain rep range, right? So I think that's kind of a way to think about it in the sense of thinking about targeting a rep range specifically can kind of lead us down that path of there's a best rep number or a best rep range for something, and that's really not how it works. And then I think the other thing that I wanted to bring up is just the thoughts on choosing rep ranges for things outside of top sets. I think you guys covered the top set stuff really well and touched on like hypertrophy work. But let's say, for example, somebody's doing accessory work. Maybe they're doing a dumbbell bench press, right? And we're trying to think, are they going to get more out of doing sets of 6 to 10 or 8 to 12, 10 to 15, whatever? And I think at that point, we're thinking about, we know from the research, those are probably very similarly effective for muscle growth, right? If we're in a phase of training where we're trying to really drill home strength and not get super fatigued, not get a bunch of muscle damage, then maybe we edge towards the lower end of that. Maybe we do sets of 8 or something, right? Because then we can stay further from failure, and it's just you're moving a heavier weight. It's more specific, quote unquote, right? Versus like other times where we're not as concerned with top end strength. Maybe it's like we're deep in a hypertrophy phase. In that sense, maybe it's somebody who, number one, maybe they struggle with rating RPE at those lower RPE ratings. So maybe if we need to push to an actual 8 or 9 RPE for them to really know what that feels like, then maybe that's better kept for those higher rep range things. Maybe it's somebody who they start getting joint pain with these heavier weights. We can do the higher, right? So I think it tends to just be more of a what's realistic for this person and what's more efficient, like per unit of volume in that sense for that, like more hypertrophy work, if we want to call it that. But I guess those are just my thoughts and sort of rounding that out. Top off what you guys said.
Very, very well said. I think that just to kind of put a bow on that, I think our current stance, and of course this is subject to change, but our current stance is that you kind of have these proactive principles of what we think the research and our experience, as well as listening to a lot of smart people. These are the things that we should really focus on dialing in. And one of those things probably is not, hey, let's find your magic rep range number. Let's focus on the big rocks, as that's going to be the biggest bang for your buck in terms of individualization. All right. I'll go ahead and throw out the next one, which is actually very similar to the first one, or at least they kind of go hand in hand. So we wanted to kind of do these back to back. So this comes from Chris. He asks, do you ever keep training weeks constant over a block? So in other words, are you always manipulating volume/intensity week to week, or do you ever repeat the same week of training within a block? Either one of you guys, feel free to take a stab at that.
Yeah, I think so. This has obviously become really popular recently, and kind of hitting on the idea that if we're minimizing changes, that's going to help our diagnostic clarity on making the individualization process a little bit easier. And I think there's definitely things to that, but I think you can also take that a little bit too far. I think in our view, generally the week to week fluctuations are going to come from a workload management perspective. So once you factor in deloads and intro weeks, and generally we like to have multiple of those, that's going to inevitably have some week to week fluctuation in variables. But once we get to kind of what we call the meat and potatoes week or your peak workload week, I think I don't know if I'm speaking for all of us here, but I know for me, the block structure looks nearly identical week to week for a few weeks. At that point, the only difference at that point would be kind of some of the artificial progression strategies that we have for top sets to kind of make sure people, even on a bad day, feel like they're kind of adding weight to the bar. which we find helps a lot of people just psychologically. So yeah, it might go, intro week 1, intro week 2. There's some week to week fluctuation there, and then from 2 to 3 a little bit more. But once you get like 3 to 5, then you're essentially completing the same training in that perspective, and that's kind of where we try to get the information in terms of that workload. Is it sustainable for the individual? Is this going to allow for long-term progress? All that good stuff. But that just kind of came to my head. So yes, I definitely do that on occasion, just within the context of those principles of workload management with intros and deloads.
Yeah, I think just to jump in here really quick, I think the way that I would summarize my thought process on this is workload changes week to week are almost always going to be proactive. So I talked about this when we kicked off the first question is I'm not going to change Thursday's squat session based on how Monday's squat session went, right? Again, I kind of explained how that just really muddies the water in terms of analyzing your training. And I think you can really get lost in the weeds if you're doing that. So again, like Zach said, there can be proactive changes week to week, but that's at least the way that we like to do it is going to be because you're doing an intro week or weeks and you're good and you're doing a deload week. And then like Zach said, once you kind of get to that peak workload that you're going to hang out at for however many weeks, there can be changes week to week, but you're not changing the workload. You're changing the configuration of that workload. And honestly, it really just comes down to psychological considerations at that point. Can some people do the exact same microcycle week after week and be fine with it? Totally. But in our experience, we find it's a neutral to positive effect of making that triple at 7 to 8 in week 3, a double at 7 to 8 in week 4, and then a single at 7 to 8 in week 5. Is that going to increase a little bit of noise when you're trying to analyze training? Potentially, but we think that trade-off is worth it, right? So again, once you get to that peak workload, the way that we like to do it is you're keeping the workload the same, and you might just play with the configuration of that workload because again, we're really trying to dial in the workload for that individual. But that's not to say there aren't times where you reactively adjust workload. But I would really only chalk it up to 2 scenarios. The first is if enjoyment is at a point that the individual can't sustain. Enjoyment is really low. Obviously, there's going to be some natural fluctuations, but there's probably a threshold where you're going to adjust training. And then the obvious one is if an ache or a pain pops up, then you would reactively adjust the workload. Of course, aches and pains are probably going to be part of our experience, but there's probably a threshold there where you are going to make some reactive changes. So again, just to summarize kind of my thoughts here is week to week changes are going to be proactive, and then they're really only going to be reactive if something extraneous happens, which is not super often. So that's my thoughts there. Jake, got anything to clean up there?
I think as always, or as almost always, I think I'll throw in some hypertrophy stuff. I think that you touched on enjoyment there, which I think is super important, especially for hypertrophy because it's more rare to see those week to week. I'm adding 5 pounds to the bar, 2.5 kilos, whatever. Because like you're saying for top sets, maybe we're doing a triple at a 7 to an 8. A lot of people are going to be able to kind of add load, week to week, or if we're doing that artificial progression that allows them to do it anyway. I have plenty of people where typically we'll start a block off with lower RPE. Maybe it's a triple at 5 or 6 or whatever, and that kind of climbs as the weeks go, right? So there's all kinds of things we can do, but in hypertrophy work, it's just so much harder for that to happen, right? And it gets very boring very quickly for somebody to be doing 3 sets of 10 with the 50-pound dumbbells or whatever. You know what I mean? Like it just. So in that case, I'm much more. I don't want to say aggressive, maybe assertive with saying like, okay, we're going to start off. You have your intro week stuff, right? Lower volume, lower RPE. But then from there, that's why I always like to use a rep range because it allows them to add a rep here and there, or maybe they can use the 55s for their first set, and then their second, third, fourth set, or the 50s, whatever. But sort of using that double progression model through those, and just being a little bit more like if they have room to add a rep or to add some load here and there for a few weeks in a row, then sweet, we're going to leave it. Maybe the protocol is sets of 8 to 12 at a 7 to 8 RPE, for example. But then it's like that's only sustainable for so long, and you get to this point where we have to kind of nudge that progression along a little bit. And I think it's also beneficial for people to get closer to failure on some of these accessory movements, just in the interest of, are you actually judging your RPE accurately, right? So as we get closer and closer to the end of a block, that's when I'll kind of be like, okay, we're going to bump up the RPE target a little bit, things like that, just to sort of, I think of it as allowing more progression to happen. So there's kind of a hypertrophy specific way to look at it, if you will. And that's sort of kind of taking into account other things too, like obviously the amount of volume they're doing can affect that too, right? If it's an intro week, let's say week 1 is 2 sets at a 5 to 6 RPE, maybe week 2 is 3 sets, but I'll leave the RPE about the same because we just don't need to throw all of that all at once. So things like that. But I guess I'm just saying that I'm a little bit more free with progressing that workload week to week on some of those movements, because it's also, there's just, the stakes are lower, right? Like you're not going to get that much more fatigue from having 3 reps in reserve versus 4 on your set of 12 leg extensions. You know what I mean? So
Yeah, I think the concept's essentially the same, especially if you're using the double progression stuff. It's like if you're allowing for that rep range, I do the same thing all the time on accessory movements. Like that's the dropping of the rep range on a top set. You're just allowing them to do that on those hypertrophy movements as well. And then you get to the point where adding reps or load is a little bit more difficult. Kick up the RPE. Now the goalpost has changed slightly, but it's the same feeling like you do on a top set. It's a very similar concept. So I totally agree.
Yeah, I have a couple clients where just from kind of understanding how they tick over time, they think things can get stale very quickly because, like you said, Jake, I think hypertrophy only training can get boring at times. It really isn't. It doesn't have to be super complicated, but I think adding some degree of complication can make things a little bit a little bit more interesting. And if you know the principles, you can kind of make week to week changes literally just for the psychological component of it. So maybe you work from sets of 12 to 14, sets of 10 to 12, sets of 8 to 10, sets of 6 to 8 throughout a block, right? Like at the end of the day, there's nothing magical about that progression. That's kind of like a linear periodized model. But if you're keeping the number of sets the same, the hypertrophy outcomes are going to be similar. And if you're getting a net positive in terms of intent and excitement for training, that's a win, right? So I think that's an example of, if you know the principles and you kind of start to understand how that individual ticks. Maybe they really like to sit at 8 sets of 8 to 12 throughout the entire block and just kind of work on adding a rep here and there when it falls within the RP range. But other individuals really want that sense of progression, even if it is artificial, to kind of get the ball rolling, and that keeps them excited. So I think this ties in well to that first question we talked about, is once you know the principles, you can make adjustments based on athlete psychology, and again, kind of starting with the average response and adjusting from there. So anything to add there about, go for it, Jake?
I think that's really important what you just said about how sometimes, like the hypertrophy work, the progressions are sometimes a purely psychological thing. And just to keep it interesting and fun, that's something that I always come back to. The debate has kind of calmed down more recently, but this whole, should we be adding sets throughout a mesocycle or keep it pretty static? If it's the same either way in terms of progress and adaptations, then like it keeps it more interesting, So I think there's an argument either way, that it's not an invalid thing to do, even if it's purely just to keep it interesting. And that's another beautiful thing about hypertrophy training being so forgiving, in terms of there's just so many things that work, and the stakes are so much lower with the fatigue cost of things. Like obviously we don't want to get crazy with fatigue, right? But it's just for like, I have some clients that are purely training for hypertrophy right now. I'm purely training for hypertrophy right now, and there are progressions that I'll do that there's sort of two purposes. One of them is purely just for the keep it interesting and fun, and then another one, a secondary purpose, is to give that more exposure to truly low RIRs, so that in the future, hopefully, they're able to judge their 3 RIR better, whatever, right? But like as an example, I have one client in particular that I'm thinking of right now, that we started out the block with just a couple of sets at a pretty low RPE, right? first couple weeks, we added some sets here and there to get up into our meat and potatoes kind of workload. We let the RPE targets kind of float up slowly. As we get towards the end of the block, now it's like, okay, cool. We're at on an average 1 to 2 reps in reserve on this. Maybe we're doing sets at 10 to 15 on something. And then it's like, I don't necessarily want him to go in week 5. We don't really need to do 4 sets to failure of this thing, right? But something that we can do to give us not quite as much fatigue, let's throw in like some kind of rest pause protocol or some sort of MyoRep thing at the end, to the point where maybe we don't push completely to failure. This is an idea that I stole from Steve Hall of, let's say you do a set to 2 reps in reserve, take a short rest period, maybe it's 10 seconds long, right? Just take a couple of breaths and then just squeeze out a few more reps until you get back to that 2 reps in reserve, right? That way we're not completely training to failure all the time. You still get a touch more volume, you get another exposure to that actual 2 RIR, right? Or at least what's likely very close to an actual 2 RIR. And it also keeps things fun and interesting. It changes up the protocol. It gives people a different psychological challenge of like, okay, I have a crazy pump. This is pretty sore, but I still need to do some reps. Here we go, right? And it just can be a way to keep things going in that sense. So I just wanted to throw that in there because I think that there's something to be said for that. And I think that's very important, that with hypertrophy training, there's not always a objectively this is better. Sometimes it's objectively it's the same, but subjectively it can be better, right?
Yeah, I think this is why, like, probably one of the primary reasons we like to periodize things. Again, in the research for strength and hypertrophy, it doesn't seem like it's uh, gonna be a massive night or day difference. You could even make the argument that it's really not gonna influence your outcomes. There are like actual reasons beyond the psychological component that we still think periodization makes sense. But even if we could somehow know that there was really no physiological reason for which periodization literally will not change your outcomes, I'd still probably periodize training just because, just for the enjoyment aspects. Right now we kind of move from these higher intraset fatigue phases, typically higher average RPEs, and then we move to these lower intraset fatigue phases for somebody that's interested in strength. I know me personally, when I move through these phases, it's new and exciting every time. And by the time you're done with the strength oriented phase, you're like, man, I'm looking forward to taking this set of high bar squats for a set of 8 to a true RP8. Like that's going to be fun. So literally just the change, I think can be beneficial in and of itself. So, Zach, you
Yeah,
have something to add?
I think, and we talk about that a lot, but I think people just don't grasp like how impactful like positive expectations and enjoyment are. Like periodization is not steroids by any means, but some of those placebo steroid studies are just absolutely mind-boggling. Like if we can get 20% of those effects, like that's huge. So I just think people are often quick to kind of shoo away. It's, I mean, if it's a psychological benefit, who cares, man?
That doesn't
It's not
apply to me.
right. Yeah, right. Um yeah, it's quick to kind of brush it aside and like um say that that's, I mean, that's okay, that's cool, but like it doesn't actually impact me. But especially I feel like for people that are in the nitty-gritty of programming and training and stuff like that, and already I think probably think periodization and like the manipulation of these variables are probably a bigger deal than they are anyway. Like I feel like the subjective expectations and positive effects you can leverage out of like having fun and trying something new is probably even greater than the average person that kind of just thinks it's all lifting weights regardless of what you're doing. Like sets of 10, sets of 6, man, what's the difference? I don't know. So I think that's something that often goes a little bit overlooked, but I totally agree, Josh. That's probably the primary reason why we like to set things up like that. But I think adding a little bit of something here and there and some change is always good and keeps people motivated, which, like I said, eventually I think we can expect to influence our outcomes.
Awesome. I'll go ahead and throw out the next question for whichever one of you guys wants to tackle this first. So the question is, what are some good markers or measures of fatigue? So just again, very straightforward. What's the best way to measure fatigue? And how much is too much? So how much fatigue is too much, or at what point do you kind of get to a level of these measurements and say, okay, that's too much fatigue, a change is necessary. So whichever one of you guys wants to take a stab at that.
Well, this is a big question, and definitely, I would say all of us are not fatigue researchers by any means. So we'll take our best stab at this, but take that as a grain of salt to start. I think from a practical perspective, the definition that probably is the most um, helpful to kind of think about is just simply a reduction of performance from baseline. So you go into the gym on Monday, you do a 10 RM with 200 kilos. The next day you come in, you could not repeat that performance. Thus, you are fatigued. That's kind of the practical definition of that. Now, in the research, they start to separate these mechanisms of fatigue and what results in that reduction in performance. And so, while these classifications definitely have feedback loops to one another, so don't take like there's this and this like types of fatigue, because there definitely is interplay between the two. But the general classifications are like peripheral versus central fatigue. Peripheral fatigue is going to be like the acute reduction in performance via the metabolites, the acidic conditions of the muscle, that kind of stuff that you can feel when you're doing a set of 20 to bicep curls. That kind of acute burning feeling in your muscle is kind of the peripheral sensation of fatigue. But then you have kind of central fatigue, which in the research, if there is I'll hook you up to this, a dynamometer, and they will electrically stimulate your nerve to see if the amount of force that you're able to produce voluntarily reduces in threshold from what can be electrically evoked, which essentially means my brain is not allowing my muscle to contract as hard. And it doesn't really have anything necessarily to do with the local condition of the muscle at that moment in time. Well, like I said, there's feedback loops. Josh is looking at me
Right.
like it's that, but that's not exactly what you're talking about when you're referencing that
Right.
portion fatigue.
The arrow goes both ways. Yeah.
Right. I tried to say that 4 times, but again, it can get
Uh,
confusing. But
yeah.
yeah. But essentially, those are the 2 types of fatigue that are generally talked about in the research. But now Josh is making me self-conscious, so I'm just going to mention, like, if you have a peripheral depletion of glycogen, that can lead to central fatigue, which is both simultaneously peripheral and central. So it's like there's a ton of crossover here. And the point being, it's very, very complicated. And the practical nugget out of all this is, when we talk about this, is like there's a ton of stuff that we don't necessarily need to know when we're making decisions in the gym. And I think the point is, we don't necessarily need to optimize for fatigue. We still need to optimize for outcomes, which is like what we were talking about earlier. So you can go way in the weeds on this of like, how do we define fatigue? What's the best way to kind of talk about it in a very specific sense? But I think ultimately, subjective measures of fatigue, I think, are ultimately, from a coaching perspective, what we're going to rely on ton on and when we're influencing our programming. So I'll let you guys take the practical route of it, but I wanted to take it off there.
Yeah, I think to kind of piggyback off the practical side of things is I really want to underscore that we're not optimizing for this Goldilocks fatigue range. We're optimizing for our outcomes. Now, on average, is kind of being in this Goldilocks fatigue range going to lead to better outcomes? Potentially, probably. But at the end of the day, if you fall outside of that Goldilocks zone for fatigue and that reliably results in better outcomes, then that's what you want to stick with. So in terms of, you know, to directly answer the question of what are good markers and measures of fatigue, um, I think that there's a couple ways to tackle this. The first is just to look at performance in and of itself, right? Zach started off with probably the most basic definition of fatigue is a reduction in performance from baseline. So if you're seeing performance going down, which is again what we care about, um, then that's an indication that the individual is over fatigued. They can't get those same peak intensity exposures, and that's probably not a great sign in terms of strength outcomes. But from more of like an athlete monitoring perspective and like a, hey, overall, this is kind of the fatigue I'm under. This is the life stress, the school stress, the work stress, whatever that I'm under in addition to training. Um, I view it as conversation starters more than anything, right? So shout out to Drake Easterhot, who has basically helped us create a red, yellow, green stoplight system for some of these athlete monitoring tools. So basically, what it does is there are upper and lower limits of agreement, and when the basically it's set up as like a total athlete readiness score. So if it's the if the system indicates that the athlete readiness is lower than normal, it'll kind of pop up red, and okay, this is the athlete readiness is way lower than normal. I don't view that as okay, I'm going to algorithmically go ahead and adjust. Um, I'm going to algorithmically go ahead and adjust the next week of training. It's, hey, what is going on? Is this something that we need to kind of plan for going forward? That kind of thing. So again, I fatigue is something I like to keep my finger on the pulse of. But at the end of the day, we're looking at the dose of training and the configuration of that dose, and we're looking at the outcomes. Fatigue is some sort of intermediary there, and it's probably just uh, a necessary or unavoidable consequence of training. And of course, there's probably going to be an average Goldilocks zone, but it's not something we're optimizing for. So I don't have like a way to perfectly quantify the fatigue the individual's under. And if it reaches a certain threshold, I make this algorithmic change. It's just, first of all, things don't work that nicely in practice. And also, I don't think that's the way you go about training. Now, of course, there's going to be extremes here, right? Again, we kind of talked about if an individual has an ache or a pain that reaches a certain threshold that warrants a reactive adjustment in workload, then that's probably indicative of fatigue. So kind of rambly there, but hopefully that makes sense that we've really underscored the point that we're not optimizing for fatigue, we're optimizing for outcomes. This is just something we're kind of keeping our finger on the pulse of. And it's just, any measure of athlete readiness is probably best suited as a conversation starter. So yeah, that's my thoughts. Jake, I'll kick it over to you, man.
I could not agree more strongly that they're conversation starters. I'm sure people are tired of me talking about this at this point, at least some of my clients, about how sometimes thinking about fatigue too much makes us feel more fatigued. And especially when top end strength performance isn't the like be all end all priority at that time, it's almost not worth putting a ton of thought into. Like you said, we want to keep our finger on the pulse, right? But it's not something, in my opinion, that is super helpful to be getting too bogged down in these tiny details. So, like as an example, um, say somebody's in a hypertrophy phase or even in a strength phase, but it's not like a peaking for a meet or a test. It's just a more, for lack of a better term, meat and potatoes kind of training block. I think there's an element of, if there's clear signs of fatigue that we need to adjust training or we need to take a deload, things like that. For example, if they're doing a triple, their top set for their squat, in week 1 it was 315, week 2 it's 320, similar RPE, week 3, et cetera. And then we get to a week where all of a sudden 295 is an RPE 9. Okay, like that's kind of a red flag, you know what I mean? So there's very clear signs, but I think there's times where we just don't feel as good going into the gym. But I think that there is something to going into the gym and just saying, I'm an athlete, I'm going to do this weight, right? So I think we need to keep an eye on fatigue, but I think that there's a time and a place for that to be the decision maker, if that makes sense. Hypertrophy training, I think it's even less so. I think that it's, dude, I know I've talked about this before. When I did my contest prep a year and a half ago or whatever, I was under the most fatigue I've ever been under, but I was still progressing every exercise every week. It was inexplainable. But so there's just like your psychology plays such a big part in it. You can still feel really fatigued, but still perform really well. So there's just, it's just sort of like what Zach was saying. There's just so many layers and so many little nuances, and I don't think we're going to be able to just pin down, okay, this is the thing we look for. That's our trigger to do the deload or to reduce volume by 10% or to whatever, you know what I mean? But some of those practical things that you're talking about, I think those make sense. Some of the other ones that I think about, just in terms of keeping an eye on things, it's like if you're feeling just generally run down, like I think that's a sign, right? Like your performance on the lifts is obviously really important, but I think if you're just feeling like garbage outside of the gym too, you're probably pretty fatigued. Things like if your motivation is super low, if your DOMS is like, there's a difference between that like acute normal training week type of fatigue in your DOMs, right? It
Big
feels a little
ache.
bit, yeah, when it starts to really build up, it's just
Yeah.
like this deep, achy,
In your
like,
bones. Yeah.
yeah, it's like it just feels different, you know? So like that kind of thing, that's something that I try to like keep near to the ground for, things like that, right? But um I now I'm rambling too. But basically that I guess I always want to bring that up, that like the fatigue is really important, the athlete monitoring is really important, but I just don't ever want to get too far down that rabbit hole to the point where we forget to still train hard. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
I literally is. I was going to hit on that too. Um, I think bringing this back to the research a little bit. If you use the kind of the standard markers of fatigue that we use in the research, if you were going to create a training program that optimized for fatigue management based on the research, your training would look really weird. Like based on what we know, training close to failure with higher repetitions is considerably more fatiguing in terms of like indirect markers of muscle damage than training with heavy weights and lower repetitions. So like if you were going to optimize for fatigue management, you're doing, Bulgarian, and that's like how to train, brother. Like, and I think obviously from a practical perspective, as from our experience, that seems kind of ridiculous. And I think this is always something I like to touch on with the fatigue research is like, again, Jake is the best hitting on this in terms of like the different parts of evidence-based practice, but like I still part of me refuses to believe that we're measuring this correctly because every single high level powerlifter will tell you that there's something inherently fatiguing to heavy loads, but that is just completely unreplicated in the research. Um, Now, does that mean that it's as fatiguing as the powerlifting lore would tell you? Probably not. Like there's definitely some utility to the current research we have, but I still feel like we're missing whatever experience that they're talking about with those heavy loads. I feel like we're missing that in the research because it's just completely counter to people's experience. So I think that's always something I like to keep in mind too is like, like I said, if you were going to assemble a training program based on optimizing fatigue based on the research that we have, it's going to look really, really weird. The other thing I was going to say is that, like both of the guys have said, like the subjective stuff is just going to tell you where to go when you're making those modifications on a training program. So like I think that's where fatigue becomes useful in terms of like using that subjective feedback and those conversation starters. I think from a practical perspective, like yes, they're conversation starters, but that information ultimately is going to inform the tweaks that you make to somebody's training program most likely. So like if you're going to use their session RPE, their DOMs, their motivation to train, that kind of stuff, like if all of those are through the roof, have a conversation with the athlete and training's not going well, both objectively and subjectively, I'm probably not going to throw more hard training at them, that kind of thing. So like that's where I do think like this overarching umbrella of fatigue measurements can be useful because it kind of tells you where to go next based on the overarching picture of like kind of what's going on with that person. But yeah.
Very well said. I think that's a really good way to wrap up this question, and that's why I kind of wanted to do it back to back with the first couple questions we talked about. In that, I think you can definitely get in the trap of, oh, it's week 3, my estimated 1RM trend is flat, I'm feeling over fatigued, thus I need to make a change, right? It's like that is you're not going to get very far in your training or your individualization of training if that's kind of the thought process you go through. Now, again, that's caveats apply here of if fatigue is just through the roof, right? And like aches and pains are popping up and you just cannot handle it. Of course, that's probably warrants an adjustment. But I think, like Zach said, we're optimizing for the outcome. And then once we kind of see the unit of training we're individualizing within through, this can indicate the direction we go next, right? If overall we saw that you were over fatigued for your bench press throughout the block and your estimated 1RM did not trend well, and also kind of layering on your subjective interpretation of your progress, things did not go well. Okay, that indicates that it's probably warranted to reduce the training volume if you felt over fatigued consistently. So that's probably the way that I would wrap that up. So I'll go ahead and throw out the next question here. Let's break this up kind of into 2 questions. So I'll start with the first part because this is a pretty long one. So it starts with, my question is basically a rant, and I'm going to kind of summarize here. So, how can anyone judge their RPE so good that you can say this was a 6.5 RPE, this was a 7 RPE, or a 7.5 RPE? And like basically they're getting into how can anyone say that, week to week my RPE is trending downward for a given protocol, thus indicating progress. So like basically how can we be that granular? And he says guys like me with a ton of work stress, family, kids, how can we make these RPE ratings reliably and how should we actually conceptualize RPE ratings kind of on this short-term time scale? I think this is a really good question. So we'll stick
Jacob,
with
it's your
that portion.
wheelhouse.
What's that?
Jake's wheelhouse. Go for it, dude.
Yep.
So the research answer is that we can't. Um, it's now, to be fair, I think that the subjects that are using this research is a little bit different from some of these, like, for example, some of the really high level IPF powerlifters that have been lifting for 15 years, and you know what I mean. So that research isn't perfectly generalizable, but it's pretty clear at this point that especially the lower RPEs, people just really struggle to rate accurately. Um, Now, I think that at the end of the day, that's not a huge issue because, like, really what we're getting at is you're not going to failure, right? It's not a maximal thing. Um, and some of these, like, super granular 6.5, 7, 7.5, I think some of that is maybe some people can judge it that accurately, right? I don't know the answer to that, for every individual. But I think that there's a large element of, let's say it's the same load, right? And 1 week felt like a 6.5, the next week it felt like a 6, right? Basically, all you're saying is it felt a tiny bit easier this week, right? So whether it was actually a 7 and then a 6.5, or it was actually a 8 and then a 7, or whatever, right? At the end of the day, the same load felt a little bit easier. So that's some progress. You know what I mean? So I try to think of it really in that way. That, like, the spirit of RPE is how hard did that feel, right? So um, the exact numbers can be helpful, and it helps to inform how the athlete felt, but I try not to get too bogged down in those numbers, just because of that reason, and because of the fact that some people will rate an RPE 7, but they actually had 12 more reps in the tank, and, like, so it can be pretty extreme. But um, I think maybe I'll leave it there and see if you guys want to chime in on that before we get into, like, how can other people with lots of life stress um, rate those things.
Yeah, I'll jump in here really quick because the more I think about this question, I think the answer is, at least how I see it, is pretty straightforward and pretty quick. The way that I would frame it if I was working with someone is, I want you to do the absolute best you can to differentiate between a 6.5 RP and a 7 RP. I don't think there's a downside there. That's going to kind of reduce or minimize the error bars around, like, our data analysis and seeing how things are trending. But I don't want you to stress out about it, and I don't want you to worry about the week to week fluctuations anyway. I'm never like, I think the overall thesis of this podcast so far throughout all these questions, which I again, I think they all go really well together, is that if you're in week 3 and you did whatever 315 at 7 in week 1, and maybe you did 315 at 7.5 in both weeks 2 and 3, so your estimated 1RM actually trended downward a little bit, I'm not going to change your training program. Like, we can't we can't know whether your program worked after 3 weeks. You need to see this stuff through. We're going to keep our finger on the pulse, do the best you can to make your ratings as accurate as possible, but there's some inaccuracy baked in. At the end of the day, it's a subjective measurement, and it's going to be influenced by who's at the gym with you. It's going to be influenced by all these other factors. Like, it's and even if even if we could differentiate between a 6.5 and a 7, like, is that really going to change our management? All that stuff is going to get ironed out over the whatever 8-week training cycle, 12-week training cycle, and then you can actually detect signal from the noise. So that's really how I would explain that. I think it's pretty straightforward in my eyes.
Literally, the only thing I have to add is, like, the way I generally frame it to clients. Um, like I said, two things to say. The first way I generally frame it is, like, I really only care if it's reliable and not necessarily valid for the most part. The validity portion of it is, like Jake said, are you training to failure? Are you not training to failure? Or are you training so far from failure that it's off the scale? Like, that's, to me, that's like the essentially the purpose of it. But so long as your ratings are relatively reliable, that's pretty much all I care about. So, like, was it a 5? Was it a 6? Was it a 6.5? I don't know. but it probably has a similar amount of error, for that individual throughout the training block. So that's really all I care about. And I very much echo what Josh said. You need long-term trends with this stuff. So if your estimated 1RM goes down a little bit, even though you added 10 pounds, and like it's so interesting to me that people can view that as a negative based on the popularity of like estimated 1RM. Whereas like, when we first started lifting, all that mattered was the load in the bar. I had never heard of RPE. So it didn't matter if it was harder or not. It didn't matter if the RPE went up 6 points. Like I put 5 more pounds on, man, I'm getting stronger. So like, while that's not objectively true, I still think it's interesting to me how people lose touch of the objective performance sometimes, and kind of overthink the estimated 1RM in short time scales. Obviously, it's a useful tool, so I don't want to talk bad about it too much, but it's just interesting how people view it. But the other thing I was going to say that I'm probably going to lose here unless uh, oh, the other thing I was going to say was I think this is why, like, I think I definitely have navigated more towards percentage based backoffs for a lot of people, is because, like, to me, that instills that I don't particularly care about the RPE. It's just getting it within the stoplight system of very close to failure, moderate, and like relatively low for a given load. Like that to me is like the main purpose of RPE. So by not having someone overthink it a ton by saying 3 sets of 5 at a 6.5 RPE, like that to me just like bakes in additional complication, doesn't necessarily need to be there. And I can prescribe a percentage of SMA 1RM that's, going to get the RPE range that I'm looking for. And it doesn't just say that like this single RPE point is what you need for optimal adaptations. I think that kind of takes away a little bit of that, overthinking that can happen if you're a little bit too specific with what you're looking for there.
Just to drive that home really quick about the E1RM thing, like I can't tell you how many people have been concerned in weeks 2 and 3 when the E1RM comes down, because week 1 is always super high, right? Because it's a lower RPE top set, and it's exactly what you're saying, right? The E1RM is helpful over time, but like week to week, especially in those early weeks, like you really can't do anything with those first few weeks. It's you got to wait, and then even then we'll see little fluctuations. If we see it dip one day, it's like maybe they just slept 4 hours last night, or maybe they just got their second vaccine shot did a couple days before. You know what I mean? It's like it could just be a one-off bad day. So I try not to. I think that's another theme of this whole podcast is like let's just not overreact to like blips on the radar. If it becomes a trend, now we react accordingly, right? And then one other thought that I had, Zach, based on what you were saying, like how you like to kind of frame this for people. I'll do a really similar thing. I'll just be like, look, whether it's a 6.5 or a 6 or whatever, do your best. If in doubt, go with your gut and move on, because it's all just going to come out in the wash throughout the training block. You know what I mean? So it's one of those things where I think that I think people picture us as being super into RPE, and that like we use it in a very, not just us, but the evidence-based community in general, of using it to try to do this sort of granular thing. And that's just not that, dude. Like it's helpful, but it's limited at the same time. So
yeah. Well, I think we can put a bow on that, the first portion of this question. And again, part of that was the Alexander, who asked this question, said, how can guys like me with tons of work stress, family, kids, how can we do that reliably? And I think that applies there, right? Is like, that's what's so helpful about RP is, and inevitably some of those things might influence day-to-day readiness and day-to-day performance. And again, so I kind of see two ways to respond to this: is use the RP to your advantage. Don't go in expecting that performance is going to be down because work stress has been high. But there's going to be probably a greater variance, and use the RP to your advantage there, and really internalize the point of not going to worry about how things trended from week 1 to week 3 of the block, because it's just, especially it's not a big deal. And then the other thing I'd say is, man, it's escaping me, so I'm gonna wrap it up there. Got anything to add about this question, or should we go to the velocity portion?
All I was going to say is just like, I just think for a lot of people to ask these types of questions, it's important to just realize that like the adaptations are not dependent on like a specific RPE for the vast majority of this kind of conversation. So like, if your top set's at 6.5 or 7.5, like, dude, it doesn't matter that much. Like it's a concept, and as long as you're not overshooting an immense degree or undershooting an immense degree, and you're within the band of acceptable, I think you're going to get the vast majorities of whatever you're doing. So I just think it's important not to overthink. Like the concept of RPE is to make sure that you're not coming in and maxing out with a given load that you should be kind of shifting based on how you're feeling that day. It's not to overanalyze to get to the exact half RPE point in most cases. So I just don't overthink it. Use the tool to what it's designed to do, and it's just to change things up a little bit if you're feeling like trash.
Yep. Really quick, I remembered what escaped me. The other thing I'd say is, if you are somebody like this individual with high work stress, family, kids, etc., like all these things that might influence training, is I think this is why we always like to keep some degree of some room for subjective interpretation when thinking about progress. So shameless plug for our individualized programming product. When you're taking your post-cycle individualization quiz, kind of going over how it went for each squat, bench, and deadlift, we do have objective ways to kind of give you some indication of how things went, but we also want you to think about these factors as well. If the last 12-week training cycle was heavily interrupted by all these things, we want that to go into the interpretation of progress. So that's the last thing I was going to add. Jake, I think I cut you off, so I'll let you chime in.
Yeah, just really quick. I just wanted to give, I guess, one example, of something that, I know I keep coming back to this, but the idea of still having the intent to make progress, even if you're not feeling your best that day, right? And then having that RPE or, whatever subjective measurement you're taking, having that in your back pocket to make those adjustments if needed. But my first priority, my goal is to make progress, right? So I think one really good example of somebody who holds to like the spirit of RPE and like uses it in a good way, but still has that mentality of I'm trying to make progress. Shout out to Jeremy Kane, client, who very serious powerlifter, right? Very serious. He's trying to be the best he can possibly be, right? He goes into every session with the intent of I'm getting a little bit more weight than I had last week for the same reps or whatever, right? It's always trying to get that little bit more performance. But along the way, if his body's telling him it's not there today, then he can still pull it back, right? But that's like his fail safe, right? Like that's his backup plan. I think that's a good way to look at it, at least for people who are trying to take competitive powerlifting as far as they can, right? Because there's that listening to your body is super important, but there's also a time and place for you just need to go in there and lift the weight, right? So I think that's just another example of somebody who's like taking all these ideas into account that, people that are stressed, they're going to have fluctuations in their readiness, etc., but still being able to go in there and train hard.
Not to take us down this tangent too far, but like I find that very interesting because the psychological perception of like the same protocol but written two slightly different ways can change that. So like for example, the quote unquote right way to use RPE is to still have a target number. So like if you have a single at a 7 to 8 RPE on the paper, you're trying to just go in there and completely not know what load you're going to use, because that might make your warm-ups like really weird. Like just taking like 5-pound warm-ups all the way up because I'm looking for exactly my 7 RP single or whatever. You're not going to do that. You're going to go in with some sort of target number. But you could write that exact same protocol, like sounds like your client Jeremy kind of has. So last week I hit 200 kilos, so this week I'm going to hit 205, and you say 1 at 205 with an RP 8 cap. It's the exact same protocol, but it's written two slightly different ways, and can have a slightly different psychological approach to those things. So I think it's interesting that you say that, Jake. And I think I've been slightly going more towards the assigned load with RPE caps recently for myself and some clients as well. And I think it's an interesting point you make, just kind of how that's viewed, and like going in with the mindset I'm going to add weight to the bar, but if kind of when I'm warming up there's a weight that hits the RPE cap, I'm going to stop. And that's just slightly different than saying it's completely open-ended, which isn't how you're supposed to use RP in the strict sense, but that's kind of how it's viewed sometimes. And I think there's an advantage to kind of having that target number.
Yeah, and having like to be fair, sometimes that'll catch up to you, right? Like sometimes you'll hit your number that you were aiming for, and you were aiming for an RPE 7, but it felt like a 9. Oops, like now what, right? So every once in a while that will happen. It's inevitable, especially if we're not doing that. Like you said, we're not taking 5-pound jumps with every warm up, because then our training volume is quadrupled for the day. So sometimes it's going to catch up to you. So then, like, for example, what we'll do is we'll say, okay, well, we got extra training stress from that top set. Let's back off the percentage for our back off work a little bit, right? Let's just make that a little bit easier, just so that we're not running you into the ground today, because we need to make sure that you're ready to squat again in 2 days, right? Things like that. So like that's something that, sometimes we'll do that. Sometimes it's maybe this training block, that more specific competition squat work is really important. Normally he goes over and does, split squats afterwards. Let's just back off the RPE on the split squats a little bit, right? Just kind of make up for that extra stress that we got earlier, type of thing. So there's all kinds of ways that you can account for that. But I think just knowing that every once in a while that's going to happen, and that's okay. You can still adjust later. It doesn't, those RPE based adjustments don't have to just be on your top set, right? If you overshoot a little bit, back off somewhere else. It's okay.
Cool. I think we can quickly talk about the second portion of Alexander's question. So he says, basically, again, he's talking about how do people differentiate between 6.5 versus 7 RPE. And he's saying the only way I can see and know that my top set was better or worse than last week is by looking at video side by side or with some sort of velocity tracker. So he asks, why are people not talking more about velocity trackers as a means to judge their day-to-day performance? So basically saying RPE for me isn't super precise. I'm assuming other people have this issue. What about velocity trackers? Why isn't this, why isn't this talked about more? Why isn't this recommended more to really make sure we know the difference between a 6.5 versus a 6.75 versus a 7? So I'm going to quickly go ahead and finish with my sarcasm here, in the sense that, again, I don't think the insane accuracy between a 6.5 and a 7 is that important. But Zach, I'll kick it over to you, because I know we've talked about this recently.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing to start with is, like, I just simply don't think that having that level of granularity is necessary. Like, that's just the first thing. Is like, I think you can get, we've talked about, this, like 99.9% of the way simply using RPE, even with its inaccuracies. I think velocity is useful to some degree to kind of bolster those RPE ratings, but that's not foolproof either. If you have technical deviation that is going to significantly influence your bar speed, which theoretically could influence your RAR. But if you fix that on the next rep, now your speed picks back up, and then, like, it's just, there's a lot of fuzziness with that. Additionally, adaptations. This is definitely not my expertise area of the research, but there does seem to be some shifting of the velocity profile over time. So your 8 RPE velocity at a given intensity may be one thing today, but 6 months later it might be slightly different. So it's not as simple as it may seem. And then additionally, it takes time to develop that profile. It's exercise specific, likely intensity specific. So there's just a lot of context that goes into developing those profiles. Now, granted, there does seem to be some research to suggest that velocity-based training can be pretty useful and may have some slight advantages to RPE. But my inclination is, the more you get experience with RPE and you use it in the context when it's the most accurate, which is going to be generally heavy loads, lower rep sets, and high-ish RPEs, I think it's going to be just as good. And not trying to do a single out of 2 RPEs that's going to be inherently limiting with RPE, and that might benefit velocity. But like I said, it's not a perfect solution regardless of which way you slice it. So yeah, I don't know if that even answered the question, but that's just kind of my general thoughts on velocity. So
yeah, I don't have much to add there, Jake. Yep. Yeah, I think, Zach, you hit the nail on the head. Just to bring that home, I think we're on the same page that level of granularity, sure, it might be a little bit better, but it's not necessary. And also, even if you do go the velocity-based trainer, the velocity route, there's no promise that's going to be perfect.
I will say, So two things, like the one study that kind of compared these two things, it wasn't a perfect training design to kind of look at this question directly. But the other thing I can't recall off the top of my head is I don't know if they were experienced with RPE, which again comes back to the point is if you use RPE for 6 months to a year, you're going to get way better at it than the first day you start, which I think is going to eliminate a lot of the differences. But two, I think they were athletes, some type of sport. And I think sometimes like psychologically those types of individuals, especially because they're not weight training isn't what they do. It's ancillary to what they do. Um, they like to have a number and do it and execute, and that's what I do. And then I can go play my real sport and do other stuff. So I think that might slightly benefit those personality types. But people that you know powerlifters or people that really really care about the performance, I think they're going to be able to use RPE even better because that's what you do. You're spending probably considerably more time training and having more opportunities to practice RPE than somebody who only trains twice a week for 30 minutes, like kind of doing the real sport. Now, don't quote me on that research. Again, not my expertise, but I think if I recall correctly, that was one of the caveats. So,
Yep. So in short, velocity can definitely be helpful. We like to use it, but it's not going to solve all your problems. So yeah, we'll go ahead and wrap up the episode here. Thank you very much for listening. Please, if you have a second, we'd very much appreciate it if you could leave us a rating and review on iTunes, and also make sure you subscribe to the podcast, as I believe that does help it out. Share it around, share it with a friend, social media, whatever you can do. We'd very much appreciate it. Thanks so much. See ya.